not sure I know. We're back to the perhaps word of the opening lines. And yet, here we go. The challenge will be for us to try to get a sense of how we're supposed to read this type of information. Of course, notice blowing the dust off of our memories is the way some have read this idea. Think about it. Rose leaves reminds us of roses, which takes us back to a garden because rose leaves have to come from a rose, and a rose grows somewhere. So we're going to have a lot of flower references, right? Flower and flowers references in this, right? Of course, some have pointed out that this is as well possibly suggesting that we don't really understand what true joy, what true peace, what true happiness is. There is a spiritual longing for those things, but we're not always clear exactly what those are, right? Let's keep reading now as we continue. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Now, of course, this shall we follow question is going to take us immediately to the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, right? Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon our table. Oh, do not ask what is it. Let us go and make our visit. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. That uncertainty about should we do this, should we not do this. Some readers of this poem, many of my students have said right away early on, I get the sense I'm not sure if I should be reading this or not. In other words, I don't know if I'm capable of reading this or not. Of course, we've always pointed out, don't be frightened. Step out, be confident, and say, we can figure out at least some of what it is that T.S. Eliot is trying to share with us, right? Now to continue. Shall we follow? Quick, said the bird. And all of a sudden, immediately we go, oh, no big shock here. If we're going to have gardens as symbols, and we will, and we're going to have trees as symbols, and we will, then obviously we're going to have birds as symbols as well. Of course, the classic symbols of birds, we think about the Bible and the Noah story, and of course the dove. We think as well, of course, about some of those great romantic poets, right? Right away we think about Keats and his nightingale, Shelley and his skylark. I've given lectures, obviously, for us on all of those, right? The idea as well of birds. I mean, we think about Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, quote, the raven nevermore. We're going to have a talking bird here in a second. Or maybe Thomas Hardy's Darkling Thrush. Go back to those comments that I've made in Senior B. You'll remember that thrush, that old weathered thrush, that bird, right, is going to sing a song in the middle of winter, right at the beginning of the 20th century for Hardy, that seems to suggest some expectation of hope. Let's see if there's any hope here. Quick, said the bird, find them. Find them. The antecedent to the pronoun they and them here has given any number of readers challenge. Exactly what is it that we're talking about? We talk about they and them. Many have said that it is the roses. Some have said it's the children that are there as represented by the roses. Round the corner, through the first gate, into our first world, shall we follow the deception of the thrush? And again here, notice we've got some kinds of questions about existentialist meanings, right? That notion of around the corner. What we want to know always seems to be out there. Have you noticed that? When you were in 8th grade, the thing you wanted most was graduation so you could come to high school. Now that you're in high school and you're seniors, the one thing that you want to know is graduation. What's going to happen around the corner? We're always kind of inquisitive. Curiosity. Remember, Daniel Bernstein called one of his great books about history and humans and history, The Discoverers. We're always interested. But notice it's phrased in the form of a question. Do we really want to know? Do we really want to go into the garden through the first gate? Here immediately we think about Plato's cave allegory and the idea of being freed from the darkness of the cave, where of course those people who are chained up in the cave, remember from book 7 of the cave allegory, they look at those shadows as if what? Right, they're real. Okay? Shall we follow the deception of the thrush? Now this notion of the word deception again is going to be an interesting idea for us along with this idea of first world. Think about Plato. The first world, of course, is the world we encounter with our senses. We're back to our 2 boxes, right? Thus the world of form. But there is as well the world of the formless, right? I mean, what does a thought look like? Reach out and touch a thought. Well, no, that's not. Oh, so you don't have a mind. No, I have a mind. It's just invisible. Or, as Stephen Pinker and others have said, the mind is the brain at work. Of course, that asks the question, well, why does it work? And the answer there is energy. Well, what is that? Well, it's not physical, it's metaphysical, right? Well, we're going to now, at line 24, into our first world. Some have equated this with Eden. We think about our paradise lost information, right, as well. And the idea that we can experience nature intentionally as we move. Now, let's go 25 through lines 31. Into our first world. There they were. Now, again, that they, maybe, I think, roses, possibly, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure, over the dead leaves, in the autumn heat, through the vibrant air. By the way, I'll just say this to you at 2B. Notice, I mean, you could do something really cool. Go through this poem and circle every preposition. There are a lot. Notice all the prepositions that I just played with. Into, right, over, through, right, and we'll see this all the way through. Above, upon, below. Well, what's going on with that? I think a lot of that has to do with the challenge to try and find a sense of place in the middle of the gyre of Yeats that he talks about in his second coming. The spinning of the world, right? The still point will be the idea here later. In other words, we're always looking to try and find some sense of place. Where are we? Well, how do we define that in language? Prepositions. Remember, a preposition is anything the squirrel can do to the log, right? Into the log, through the log, around the log, below the log. But about all of that, there's that sense of where you are. Notice. So here we go. Moving without pressure over the dead leaves. Of course, we think about fall and we think about autumn. In the autumn heat, through the vibrant air. And the bird called in response to the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery. Now, let's just point out that while Eliot doesn't give direct quotation references and citations to a lot of the stuff he's borrowing, clearly here he's borrowing from Keats and his ode on a Grecian urn. Remember what Keats said in that poem? Go back and look at that lecture again. He says, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter, right? We're playing the same game. The unheard music hidden in the shrubbery, and the unseen eye being crossed. For the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. Now, here, of course, autumn, representative of, some have read this as death. The music of nature, right, unheard. We've talked about Keats as well. This notion of direct hearing versus hearing through distortion or intentionality, all is being played here as well. Let's continue now at line 32. There they were as our guest, accepted and accepting. So we moved, and they, in a formal pattern, a key word, along the empty alley, into the box circle. We're moving now through Burnt Norton back into the garden, and in the garden there's a pool there. To look down into the drained pool. And you can visit this today, by the way, and many do because of their love of this poem. You go there, and it's an empty pool. It's drained, right? And then, of course, this notion of the drained pool as opposed to the wasteland where it's dry, right? Okay, but we're in a garden. But notice line 36 begins with the word dry, the pool, and then a repeating of the word dry. Dry concrete, brown edge. We immediately think of the wasteland, don't we? And the pool was filled with water out of sunlight. Many have read this as spiritual renewal is already beginning to be introduced. And the lotus rose. Quietly, quietly, the surface glittered out of heart of light. The lotus rose. Now, this is significant. We're going to have flowers that will matter in this poem. Roses, of course, represent Christian theology. Lotus represent Hindu and Buddhist theology. Now, go back to what I said in my intro lecture. For Eliot, he has absolutely no problem respecting, venerating other religious traditions while still at the same time holding on as sacred and most sacred to him, his Christian tradition. The lotus, of course, is a fascinating flower in Buddhist and in Hindu study. Why? Two things. It grows out of the mud. The mud obviously becomes symbolic of this thing we call our normal life, right? And the lotus, therefore, will represent enlightenment. It becomes the symbol of spiritual enlightenment. So here we go with the lotus rose, right? Now, notice the word rose can also mean a verb as well as a noun, right? The lotus rose quietly, quietly. The surface glittered out of heart of light. That notion of heart of light, of course, is as well going to be significant for us because it's going to suggest that in the end, light is what we all seek, to go back to our Dante, right? You remember from Hollow Men, T.S. Eliot, there are no eyes here in this valley of dying stars, right? This broken kingdom of our lost jaws. The idea of we seek for some kind of heart of light. We don't always find it. And they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed, and the pool was empty. It's a beautiful light. There's a sun. It's filling up the pool, and then all of a sudden a cloud comes and kind of wipes away the sun, and then we're back to the empty pool again. Some have said that this is just Eliot referencing the walk that he took with Emily Hill when he visited Bert Norton for the first time, and maybe he had this experience, right? Starting at line 42 now. "Go," said the bird. Again, the birds are talking. Now we're reading in figurative, and in the same way that we would read, any kind of poem where there's talking birds. Probably this is just what he imagines the chirping of birds is telling him. "Go," said the bird, "for the leaves were full of children." And immediately with this notion of children, we have innocence. That takes us to Wordsworth's The Rainbow, right? The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be about each to each by natural piety, right? Notice as well this idea of the children playing. We think about gardens, we think about swinging, we come to that word picture we've played with often, that from the very beginning in our lives they were teaching us about swinging at the park, and the fact that you have to go to the van even if you don't want to go to the van. In other words, this time is beautiful. And notice, hidden excitedly containing laughter, children's laughter. Several scholars have pointed out that for Eliot there had to have been a bit of the tragic for him in the realization that he lived his life and never had children of his own. But we know that he loved children. And one of the reasons why he wrote his book of cats is so that he could share them with children. And children often love them. The laughter of children. And then finally to finish, "Go, go, go," said the bird. And then a colon at line 44. And then one of the most quoted lines from Bert Norton. "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." Now this is an interesting idea for us. So we maybe want to pause and ask, how much do we really want to know about the lives that we live? The suggestion here is, I don't know if we can always handle the truth, to quote from an older movie, right? That idea that it's not always clear how much we can bear of reality, of the truth of our lives, right? To continue, line 46, "Time past and time future." Notice it's different wording there. "What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present." Now, this idea takes us, of course, back to lines 9 through 10. And the idea, of course, as well, is that the very first challenge of this poem, in Room 303 language, as we often will say it, is to identify the ways monkey mind, our inability. Remember, we imagine that's that word picture of the monkey in an iron cage with the fire underneath him. The poor monkey, every time he touches the cage, he's getting burned. That notion that we're constantly, our mind is constantly distracted on to the next thing. And to that degree, we never can quite focus. And that inability to focus makes us unable to appreciate that there is no past, there is no future, there's only now, right? Well, let's go quickly now to level 2A, the idea of living in the present, right? No shame of the past, no fear of the future, right? At 2B, of course, the symbolism, we've already commented on the garden, the birds, laughing or playing children, right? The idea that children are innocents for us. At 3A, well, we think about any number of poems about birds. Think about Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Think about Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, to borrow from that famous poem of Dunbar. At 3B, that's an interesting question. Why, for you, is it so hard to live in this very moment now? For example, we're about to turn now to part 2 of Bert Norton. And for some of us, we will admit, already our minds have been wandering and we've had a difficult time concentrating. When's the old man going to stop droning on about this stupid poem? I'm going to challenge you now. As we go back to the Guinness reading, I'm going to challenge you to actually read lines 49 to 92. That's a number of lines, and I'm going to challenge you to actually follow and concentrate. More particularly, I'm going to challenge you to pay attention to the first moment that you lose concentration. Now, the irony of that will be the very lines that T.S. Eliot will be talking about is specifically about that inability to focus and to concentrate. All right, let's continue now. Part 2.
Garlic and sapphires in the mud clot the bedded axle tree. The trilling wire in the blood sings below inveterate scars, appeasing long-forgotten wars. The dance along the artery, the circulation of the lymph, are figured in the drift of stars, ascend to summer in the tree. We move above the moving tree, in light upon the figured leaf, and here upon the sodden floor below, the boarhound and the boar pursue their pattern as before, but reconciled among the stars. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity where past and future are gathered. Neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline. Except for the point, the still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance. I can only say, there we have been, but I cannot say where. And I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. The inner freedom from the practical desire, the release from action and suffering, release from the inner and the outer compulsion, yet surrounded by a grace of sense, a white light still and moving, Erhebung without motion, concentration without elimination, both a new world and the old made explicit, understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy, the resolution of its partial horror. Yet the enchainment of past and future, woven in the weakness of the changing body, protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. Time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time, but only in time can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbor where the rain beat, the moment in the draughty church of Smokefall be remembered, involved with past and future. Only through time, time is conquered.
All right, let's turn now to part 2, and section 2, movement 2, as it sometimes is called. Now, right away, we're going to maybe, I hope, begin to get a sense of how to read this kind of poetry, right? For example, look at it on the page and notice. Let's just make a 2B observation really quickly. Notice that lines 49, garlic and sapphires in the mud, down to but reconciled among the stars, line 63, as we're counting them, line 63. Notice that the lines are formatted differently from the lines that then follow starting at 64, which become longer lines. Do you see that? Right? So you have almost like a little bit of a song happening here that will kind of set us up for a little lyric poem that's coming. Now, we should point out that influential in our reading of this Burnt Norton will be our comments from Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. The sea is calm tonight. Go back to that one. You'll remember that in the middle of that, by the way, a 5-part poem, in the fourth movement, you'll maybe remember this, right? I'm sorry, in the third movement, we have that notion of the sea of faith was once two at the full, and round earth's shores lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. In other words, this notion that we're living in a skeptical age, when we can't really believe as well anymore. All of this is going to play into part 2. So let's take a look now and work through it. Lines 49 to 53 is where we'll first of all focus. Garlics and sapphire in the mud. We're back to the lotus flower with the word mud. Clot the bedded axle tree. The idea of being stuck in the mud. The trilling wire in the blood, and of course the trilling wire here will immediately take us to the Great War. Sings below inveterate scars, appeasing long-forgotten wars. Let's say a couple of things here right away. Dancing and singing. are going to be significant in part 2. So write that down. Number 2, World War I is only called World War I because of World War II. And the idea that we would go through the process a second time is horrific. But wars, the Great War especially, something that is forever stuck. It's like a scar stuck in the mind, allowing us to not ever somehow get away from it. We struggle then with the fear, the depression, the spiritual emptiness that will be a part, of course, of this kind of thing. And then at line 54, we move from the singing to the dancing. The dance along the artery. We're going to talk a lot about dancing in the 4 quartets. The circulation of the lymph are figured in the drift of stars. That is to say, there's natural patterns which seem to kind of enforce the way life works, the history of the world. Ascend to summer in the tree. We move above the moving tree. If you had the perspective, the ability to try and see some kind of patterns in the light upon the figured leaf. We're back to the rose petals again. And here, upon the sodden floor, notice, by the way, all of your prepositions again. Above, upon, below. Below, the boarhound and the boar pursue their pattern as before, but reconciled, we think of redeeming time, right, among the stars. In other words, conflict resolution. It almost always seems the boarhound and the boar. There almost seems to be in nature, ingrained in nature, what Plato would call that first box, right, that first domain of the senses. Violence is always there. We can't ever seem to get away from it. The cycles of life and death are somehow maybe reconciled among the stars. That is to say, maybe the pattern of God. Starting at line 64, there's a shift. And we will be